When we think about the new workplace, post COVID, going back to the office, embracing digital, we hit the reset button on how corporate culture really works. And we really were kind of given a shock crash course, if you will, on what we were doing wrong before and what we really should be doing now. And a big part of that is diversity and inclusion and how to effectively do that with intention. And that's kind of where we start today with a new blog out of Canadian Equity Consulting. The title is Building Culture with Purpose: How Inclusion and Belonging Drive Performance. And it's an interesting idea how we can achieve these goals that we've set for ourselves and what the actual outcomes of those goals are. And so my guest today, we have Ivana Lockheed, who is the actual author of the blog and a culture strategist, and Jessica Lynn, who is an HR leader. Thank you both for joining me. How are we doing today?
Amazing.
Thanks for
Really
having
excited
us.
to talk a bit more about this.
Great.
Yeah, it's such an important topic. So thanks for
It
having
really
us.
is. And I actually want to start with the first line in the blog, which was really what caught my attention. And it's inclusion is often talked about as an organizational goal or value, but it's really a daily experience. Ivana, how did you land on that as the opening? And what would you like to get across
Mhm.
with an opener like that?
Yeah, I think it's just over the years leaning into this work and realizing that inclusion cannot be announced, cannot be a bold statement. Inclusion is experienced regular day-to-day interactions. And so it's when it comes I feel it comes down to really how people feel, whether they feel seen, they feel heard, are they respected in the everyday moment. So it's the relational piece, right? I feel like if people are constantly second guessing how they're being perceived or whether they're really welcome at this table, then we're not driving inclusion. So it comes down to those small micro experiences. It's things like who gets interrupted, whose ideas are actually credited, who gets access to these interesting, exciting stretch roles within organizations and things like that. And so when we can think about inclusion and inclusive cultures as really trying to embed that openness, that fairness, that experience of belonging into the mundane, it becomes really meaningful. So I that's why I wanted to kind of start that piece with it's not some strategy, it's not some bold statement. It's really the relational day-to-day micro moments that really matter.
Jessica, for you and someone who, HR is your area of expertise, those conversations must be difficult when someone comes up to you and said, I had a really great idea and I feel like I just got passed over because I am a person of color, a minority. How do you have those difficult conversations and then, start to lay the foundation for meaningful change when you see these roadblocks for these people?
Yeah, that definitely happens a lot, especially, I mean, all employees, but definitely frontline employees, for example. These kind of comments come about. So I think the most important thing is to better make sure that all voices are heard. And like in your example, that not some people are passed up based on certain aspects of their identity. So I think measurement is important when it comes to measuring whether a culture is inclusive. And, we really tend to measure things that we really care about. So like I'm really driven by data. So data like employee engagement surveys, other confidential feedback mechanisms, that is the most important thing I think in order to make sure that we hear from everybody and everyone's feedback and ideas to see how people feel day to day, to make sure that they're heard and seen and respected. So yeah, I think that's a critical part that we have to look at and making sure that we hear everyone's feedback. Yeah, that would be my first step into measuring how inclusive a culture is.
Where do you think corporate culture is lacking right now in this? Because, I mean, we're starting to see larger companies both step up their initiatives and also step them back in response to what's happening in the United States. So, how do we start instituting these changes in order to create a better working environment for people? And
Yeah.
feel free, both of you, to answer that.
I mean, that's the question we've been grappling with for months now. How do we stay the course and continue to do culture work via inclusion, via belonging when these conversations are being critiqued and, there's a lot of folks trying to push back against them. I think this is where HR really comes into the sort of conversation here. And this is how I think of HR as becoming the architect of these conversations, of people systems, of culture. And I think it becomes culture, like if we're focusing on that right now, it becomes very real through the structures that really govern how we work, how we hire, how we promote, how we onboard and evaluate, things like that. So when those systems are designed with inclusion and equity in mind, that's when it becomes more day to day. So I think it's HR's requirement, and it's HR's responsibility to enable that work, not to gatekeep it. And we see a lot of that happening where, HR is being tasked to own culture, to lead systems change. And in fact, the job isn't to own inclusion or equity and whatnot, but it's really to step into that enabling role as an HR leader. And so that means equipping leaders with the tools, constantly looking for equity and inclusion gaps within the existing systems that support their people, and then finding ways to hold organizations accountable. So just coming back to your question of how do we kind of continue doing this work, I think that's a huge part of how HR needs to function and should continue to lead in this work. Yeah, that's sort of, I think, how I would frame it. Jess, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, of course, on anti-DEI backlash and things like that, because studies have shown like all that pushback regarding anti-DEI is really comes down to mainly people not understanding what DEI means, what it actually means. It's been kind of negatively associated with things that are maybe not so accurate, because if people really did understand what it really meant, it just means fairness. And I think everyone agrees that we want fairness at work. Nobody wants favoritism at work, probably. It's pretty safe to say. Everyone wants parental leave and parental benefits, no matter what that parent looks like, and nobody wants harassment and discrimination. I think we can all agree on that, and that is all DEI, right? That's all just DEI work, and that's all fairness work. And so no matter what you call it, it's still going to be there, because HR is a lot of that work, in terms of making sure that there's no discriminatory behavior, making sure the benefits are all inclusive. So yeah, so of course HR has a huge role to play from the entire life cycle, even from branding to attracting to retaining. And my kind of specialty is I talk a lot about performance reviews, because that's the retention piece, and there's so many ways that bias can creep into those processes. Probably don't have time to go through every tip I have, but there's so many things that you can inject in every step of those performance review processes, assessments, that can make the process more inclusive and more bias free. So yeah, every HR has such a big role to play in rolling out those inclusive processes and practices.
So, we can always highlight what's not working, what's wrong, but let's highlight what happens when this is implemented and when these changes, this intention to be inclusive and to improve workplace culture is actually delivered upon. And so, what do you think a truly inclusive workplace culture looks, and maybe even more importantly, feels like?
Yeah. I think I'll comment on, there's a part of the blog that talks about psychological safety, and I feel I want to start with that concept a little bit, because I really feel strongly that it is the soil for inclusion and for inclusive cultures. It's the foundational sort of condition for that experience to grow within your organization. What we know to be true through study after study is that psychological safety can build things like trust. And we know that trust within, your organizational culture can unlock performance. So when people know that they won't be shamed or penalized for sharing ideas, challenging ideas, admitting mistakes, they obviously show up. They can show up with more creativity, more initiative, they have more accountability, and it becomes a really high performing culture that way. It improves team dynamics as well. There's really endless outcomes and benefits from prioritizing the process of building an inclusive culture. So I'll start with that psychological safety piece as the soil and the conditions for this to actually work well. What we know also through study after study is that inclusion and inclusive cultures drives employee engagement. So when folks feel, so now that we've established psychological safety, when people that now have the ability to feel valued, to feel respected, they can bring more energy, more creativity to their work. And that's linked again to engagement, but also performance. So they're not just showing up to do their job, they're actually leaning in and they're bringing ideas to the table. So yeah, I think those would be some of the outcomes from this work. That's what it can look like, right? If you are intentional and you are focused on driving cultures of inclusion, of belonging, of equity, these things can all really flourish. Yeah.
Obviously, I agree. And like that psychological piece, I think, is the most important piece in a truly inclusive culture. Other things that come to mind in terms of what a truly inclusive environment feels like, looks like, smells like, is, just very, where DEI is not even a thing anymore. Like it's not like we're doing a DEI initiative, we're doing a whatever. Like it's not even like such a spotlight placed on it. It's just a norm. It's just like it's what do you mean it's our everyday interactions and our everyday practices. So that to me is what it feels like. But to get there, obviously it would be organizations putting in the work to have gotten there. They would have checked for gaps in access, gaps in influence, representation, opportunity, things like that. That's how I see that they can achieve it. Another way is I always talk about kind of leaders, like the ideal leaders. Some studies have also shown that like the most ideal respected leaders are the ones that show vulnerability. So, and it all comes from the top down, right? So a truly inclusive culture would ideally have a leader who is very vulnerable, leaders, and in the sense that they set a certain goal, let's say a certain inclusion goal, and then providing the update that they didn't meet that goal and saying like, hey, we set this goal for inclusion and we didn't hit it, we failed, being open and vulnerable. It's not always having to be perfect in a leadership positions, kind of normalizing learning from failure. So I think those would be key also to have those kind of leaders to create a truly inclusive workplace.
Yeah. I'll just add one more component to that. When I think of what it really looks like, I talked a bit about the outcomes of what it could be, what you're driving and striving for. I think when somebody and organizations and people within these organizations, when they feel included, they often don't have to waste that energy managing impressions or hiding parts of themselves. And so that cognitive and emotional energy that to that energy can go towards their work, and then that fuels creativity and growth. So I like to sort of define an inclusive culture as one where people can actually exhale, they can breathe a little more clearly, a little more freely.
Do you think there's a little bit of hesitation to jump on these changes because people are terrified of their HR departments? I mean, we're in culture, if we think about television and movies, HR is the butt of the joke so often in these workplace comedies. And so people go into the workplace and they're almost like conditioned as teenagers. You think of like The Office as a great example. They're kind of like conditioned to be hesitant to be open with HR and to be honest with them. I mean, what kind of advice would you give to an organization or their workers who are hesitant about being open with HR because they maybe haven't had any actual really experience dealing with them before?
Yeah.
Jess, I'll let you. I've got thoughts, but my guess is you got some really lived experience with
Only
that.
from like I guess real experience, but I'd be curious to hear, Ivana, what you think from like outsider perspective, like external to HR perspective. But it's funny, I've never watched The Office. My HR colleagues think that's wild, but I haven't watched it. But yeah, I'm so sick of the jokes of like when I was HR, like HR is here, like stop the fun and all this stuff, or when I was a consultant being HR, walking in and be like, that HR person is here, someone's getting fired. So yeah, very negative, not a great reputation we have. So, and I definitely have kind of struggled with that because employees, me specifically, they tend to trust, telling me certain things, bring complaints forward, which makes me so happy because I want to be able to support that. I want people to have the psychological safety to come forward and bring concerns that are maybe not so popular and, scary. But to a certain point, there are some folks that are like that they trust HR, but then some will be like, well, the employer is paying your paycheck. So like, are you really going to be on my side? So I think it's really important to make sure that the people who don't trust HR, it's probably coming from a place of trauma in the past. They brought things forward, they've done investigations, they feel like it wasn't done fairly. So I think HR just needs to do a really good job, in my opinion, of doing everything on the up and up. When there is a complaint, make sure that it is dealt with immediately, a timely fashion, impartially, making sure that all witnesses, any parties involved are interviewed, all voices are heard in a situation, and of course not show that favoritism. But being, again, as vulnerable and transparent as possible with employees in situations such as investigating an incident, and then also just, of course, making policies as transparent as possible to know that people know exactly what the process is and the exact steps, like however clear you want to make it, like the clearer the better, because people are fear of the unknown, right? So they're like, I'm never going to report something, I don't even know what the process is. Like, am I going to report something, get fired? Am I going to report something confidentially, but it's not going to be confidential, and the person that it's about is, going to make my work life hell for the rest of the time here? So making the process very, very clear and transparent, and then carrying out the process very clear as well.
Yeah, and I think to achieve that desired state that you just described, Jess, I think it's important to recognize, at that table, at that HR leadership table, what's not working within their teams. And so if an HR leader isn't getting the respect or the voice or the opportunity to lead that function the way they know to be correct, the way they know to be effective. And we've seen that a lot in organizations where HR has that reputation where they're doers, right? They're doers for the employer. And then that's where we get into these situations where no one trusts that group of people because they report into executive teams that may ask too much of them, or that may expect them to deviate from their understanding of what effective and modern and true HR looks like, which is being an advocate for the people of the organization while maintaining organizational systems and values and whatnot. So I think to achieve that state where there is trust with HR, it starts at the very, very highest levels where they need to bring in HR leadership, give them voice, give them a place to lead the way that they, see to be the right way.
It's good to have that definition. I think that gives people some clarity where they may not have it previously. We're talking about the idea of connecting inclusion and performance, because I think probably some people at face value may not think those two do not go hand in hand. One is a feeling and the other is actionable at work. And so what does this connection actually work like between these two? Because we know it's there. And how can leaders cultivate it? How can they really show that performance and inclusion do go hand in hand?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about if you're in an organization, like when have you felt your best? When have you been able to show up and really perform at higher levels? And in my experience, I have felt my best when I have felt valued, when I have been given respect. I've been able to lean in and drive really great work. And I don't think I do think that's a very common experience for most folks, right? And so I think, from a leadership perspective, when we think about what they need to do to really cultivate that, I think if they want to cultivate that kind of performance, a high performance culture, they need to lead with inclusion. And so they need to set that tone at that very high level. So by modeling the inclusive leadership traits like curiosity, vulnerability that Jess talked about, prioritizing fairness and community in everything, right? And so if they can do that, if they can prioritize those things and really practice those and role model for the rest of the organization, they can start to create those environments where they feel safe. People feel safe again to take risks and to lead and to take initiative, and for folks to really feel confident that their efforts matter. And so, yeah, that's a bit on my side. Jess, what do you think?
Yeah, of course, I agree with that. And, making sure, obviously, when people feel like they belong, they're more engaged, which is kind of what aligned with what you were saying. So, like, I think to me, aligning kind of performance expectations with inclusive values. So rewarding employees is very big in signaling what matters, like rewarding the behavior that you want to continue. So rewarding the inclusive behavior and, progressive discipline for things that are not inclusive. We always say kind of like hire slow, but not like, but it used to be fire fast, but like I would disagree with that. Kind of like the discipline part, you do that fast, it's timely, it's not just letting exclusionary behaviors fester and it becomes a norm, right? So as soon as it's happened, you kind of nip it in the bud. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about performance, like rewarding the right behaviors and disciplining the wrong ones. So and then I actually did a webinar, like internal webinar with retentions. A lot of that is another big topic that came up that people like to talk about is like mentorship and sponsorship. That drives performance too, and gets people to stay at an organization. Kind of sponsors that go above mentoring, they actively advocate for people who may have not the opportunities access that they would, and maybe people who don't self-promote as much, such as women and underrepresented folks. So yeah, I think mentorship and sponsorship plays a huge role in the performance of employees and retention as well.
In a few, as quick of an answer as you possibly can, because I think a quick, concise thing sometimes it makes it hit a little bit harder. What does a more human and intentional way of working mean to both of you right now?
Yeah. I think a little soundbite here would be on we don't need perfect workplaces, but we do need ones that are honest, that are caring, and they are willing to adapt. And that is how I feel a more human organization functions and how they show up.
Yeah. We're really pressure for a short, snappy one-liner, but yeah, I think as you mentioned at the top of this session, COVID has really just changed the way we think about work. So I think it would be such a disservice to keep doing what we've been doing. So I think flexibility for me is key for a more human-centric, approach. We're not building jobs that people can fit into. We're building kind of jobs that are aligned with people's personal interests as well as professional interests. And then, like I said, the flexibility, the hybrid work, and different, leave options that are more broader than the traditional. So I think flexibility in work design is.
Well, thank you so much for both of you for your time today. The blog is Building Culture with Purpose, How Inclusion and Belonging Drive Performance. I appreciate your insight and having the kind of conversations that can hopefully make a more meaningful workplace that people feel genuinely excited about going into, whether it's through a screen or around a board table. So thank you both for your insight. Appreciate it greatly.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.